Good evening. I am Mercy Priya, District Program Manager, Additional Skill Acquisition Program, Kozhikode. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on Viral Histories, Epidemics and the Making of the World by Professor Dilip M. Menon, Mellon Chair in Indian Studies, Director, Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. He was educated at the University of Delhi, Oxford, and Cambridge. He has authored a fair number of articles and books on caste, socialism, and nationalism in India. A few of his important works are Caste, Nationalism, and Communism in South India, Malabar 1900s to 1948, Cambridge University Press 1994. Saraswati Vijayam, Book Review Literary Trust, New Delhi 2002, a translation of Poderi Kunyambu's novel of 1893 from Malayalam. The Blindness of Insight, Essay on Caste in Modern India. I take this opportunity to welcome all the participants to this session. Kindly note that the students who are unable to attend this live session for various reasons, including connectivity and lack of facility, can view the video through ASAP YouTube channel. I once again welcome all to our webinar titled Viral Histories, Epidemic and the Making of the World by Professor Dilip M. Menon. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's now around 12:30 where I am. Greetings from the Southern Hemisphere and greetings also in the month of Ramzan, which is when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet. So hopefully from this crisis that we're all going through, we shall arrive at a state of better knowledge about ourselves, politics, society, and indeed the new world that we're entering. Because for all of us, I think this is a crucial and a very different period in world history. I'm 57 years old now, and never in my life have I experienced a period of lockdown such as this, where I've had to be at home, not seeing people, not being able to go shopping in the ways that I did, not being able to go visit friends and restaurants and so on. So the whole meaning of what is social has changed. And it's also the forms of sociality, thinking about visits, going for prayers, whether it's in temples, churches, or mosques, feasting, which is an integral part of Ramzan, but now that feasting is something that's restricted to the home, to the family. And so we're thinking about a period in which we shall have to redefine our notions of community, our modes of conversation. I'm talking to an invisible audience of around 138 people. I can't see any of you. I can't see whether you're awake, asleep, sleeping, laughing, smiling, bored, on your phones. I can't see all of that. It's at the same time, it's not distracting for me, but at the same time, not having that human connection is something that does something to the very act of teaching itself. So the Italian novelist Antonio Scorati wrote recently in the Corriere della Sera, "How can I explain to my daughter that when I look out of the window, I see the end of an era?" And this is indeed what we are thinking about. We are living in a period where something is ending, we are not sure what, and something new is beginning, again, we are not sure what. All that we know is that this is an unprecedented situation in our times of lockdown and quarantine, and we are beginning to wonder whether wearing masks, for example, will become part of our everyday life now. Because as we know, in Southeast Asia and Japan, particularly when we see tourists who come from there, they have these masks on and they don't see it as something strange or related to a crisis. It's become a part of their everyday lives. At the same time, if you look at the media, you look at scholars who are writing about the present time, there is this constant invocation of the idea of the end of times. And you find people saying, is this an end to capitalism? Is this an end to globalization? Is this the end of the dominance of China? And I think we need to step back a bit from this prediction and prophecy, because thinking from within the horizons of a situation is not always useful, and we must wait before rushing to predictions. So in that sense, this is a time that's given to us for reading, reflection, And indeed, under lockdown, this is what a lot of us have been doing. We've been confined to our homes and our books. Certain trends are clear, of course. Tolstoy began his novel Anna Karenina by saying all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is different in its own way. Similarly, we could say that all lockdowns may be alike, but the lives of different people under lockdown are different, each in their own way. So if you think about the poor who are without homes, what does lockdown mean? Or you think about migrant laborers who are living 20 to 30 to a room, what does lockdown mean for them? Or indeed, when you think about women under lockdown, the increased instances of domestic violence. The Delhi Police Commissioner has reported 1,000 to 1,200 calls per day of domestic violence happening to women under lockdown. So our experiences under lockdown are very different. But on the surface, at least, no one can exit from the situation. We're all under lockdown, even though the circumstances may be very different. The second thing is that another world has become much more visible as we see the greatest movement of people in India since the partition, since 1947, as labor, migrant labor has been cut adrift. And here we must remember that what is happening in Kerala is always very special as compared to the rest of India. Right? So migrant labor has been cut adrift, and migrants are walking, cycling between 200 to 2,000 kilometers to return home. The impact on the informal sector as well as domestic economies is something to be thought about. So very recently, there was a news item of a man from Assam reaching home after a 2,800 kilometer long trip from Gujarat. So mention 2 points here, and then I'll just get on to my third. This is a question that we will go on to speak about slightly later. In the present time in India, we are seeing minimization of democratic norms as the government acquires more powers of law and order, administration, and financial deployment without discussion. I mean, there wasn't very serious discussion about how the lockdown was to be implemented, what were the procedures to be adopted under lockdown, and so on. And we seem to be doing this on a very makeshift basis. But what is very clear that there are very strong controls over democratic protest, which are in place right now. The magazine Economist called this the evolution of something that they call pan-democracy. So democracy under a pandemic. The other question that we need to think about is that given the circumstance of a Hindu nationalist government in power in India, we're also seeing a forced increase of interfaith distance and irresponsibility and hatred on social media, the circulation of rumors. Now, as we know, rumors and crisis are joined at the hip. All occasions in world history of whether it is of epidemics or of political disorder, rumors have circulated, and this has caused violence between communities, rifts between communities, and so on. We're also seeing an increasing distancing from the poor and the vulnerable in society, children in particular. The United Nations has pointed to the fact that there are 369 million children across 143 countries who rely on school meals for survival. Right? It's not just to get them to attend school, but that the school meal is probably the only nutrition that they get during a day. So how do we think about this event under lockdown? And finally, before we get on to the substance of the lecture, a new vocabulary is emerging. So we're becoming familiar with phrases like self-isolation, social distancing, which of course is a very fraught term in a country like India, which is governed by issues of caste and of untouchability, where the poor, as much as the lower caste, there is a social distancing that proceeds all the way from everyday interaction to questions of marriage and so on. So what does this phrase social distancing do in a society such as ours, as opposed to societies elsewhere? A lot of people have been recommending the use of the phrase physical distancing, which is probably also slightly more accurate. We've all learned complicated and complex words like zoonosis, about which more we shall speak some more. We've also learned phrases like flattening the curve, which of course does not refer to our expanding waistlines under circumstances of lockdown eating. Community spread, and doom scrolling, where we get onto the net and look at statistics of the deaths every day. This used to be a practice engaged in by our parents, grandparents, granduncles, and so on, who would look at the Madhrubhumi or the Kerala Kaumudi or Malayalam Manorama every day to see who of their colleagues and friends had passed on. But now we are compulsively doom scrolling the net to see the levels of deaths which are happening in the world. So that's just by way of an introduction. There are three themes that I'd like to touch upon in this webinar. The first would be to look at a brief history of epidemics and pandemics in the modern world. The second would be to think about the idea that I mentioned earlier of pan-democracy, and also this idea that, again, the magazine Economist has coined of coronopticon. This comes from the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon, of the fact of a power being able to view everyone at once. So if you have a jail and a jail tower, the prison guard warden is able to see all the prisoners. And now we're thinking about state surveillance, which has been on the increase over the past few decades. And the onset of COVID-19 has allowed governments to actually gain more powers of surveillance over populations for reasons of health and care as much as curbing political dissent and so on. And finally, I'll just talk about what next after this. So to begin with, a brief history of epidemics and pandemics. One of the memories that has been brought up in this moment of crisis is that of the Great Spanish Flu of 1918. Now, this was an event of an order that had never been witnessed before in the modern world. And it's too early to tell, given the progress of the COVID-19 virus, what the ultimate number of fatalities will be. The Spanish flu at its height affected 500 million people all over the world and left close to 50 million dead. And this was more than both the world wars combined, the number of deaths. So this is something that is quite significant. In colonial India itself, 11 to 14 million people died. One of the first historians to work on this, a man called Ira Klein, attributed the high number of deaths to a particular form of modernity, a particular form of colonial modernity, shall we say. And he pointed to three things. The first point that he made was that as India entered a phase of modernity and economic development under colonialism, the building of irrigation canals, the attempts to promote agriculture in order to realize more land revenue and so on, there was a disruption of natural lines of drainage, the creation of swamps, which are breeding grounds for malaria, for example, and other illnesses. The second thing that he points to is the laying of railways from the mid-19th century and the opening of the Suez Canal, exposing India to global epidemics. And if you think about the railways, there's a very curious sentence in Gandhi's Hind Swaraj where he says that the trains are the carriers of disease. Now, this didn't make much sense to me when I read it, but in the context of epidemics, it does become very clear that trains and forms of transportation become the means through which sick bodies travel across a geography, infecting other bodies. And so in that sense, both the railways as well as the opening up of the Suez Canal had consequences in domestic ways as well as global ways. And finally, and this is an issue that we'll again come back to later, the insufficiency of public health institutions and measures in colonial India. So conditions of living, global connections, insufficient state capacity and oversight, all of this remains familiar even in our time. The question of vulnerability related to social and economic situation is also something that's becoming more and more evident. So in the US, large numbers of African Americans are dying. In the south of the United States of America, conditions of poverty, conditions of ill health, also the fact that a large number of them form the foot soldiers who are manning the medical establishment as nurses and so on and so forth. So this question of vulnerability is something that we need to think about here as well. During the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 in India, more women than men died. This is similar to what happened during the Bengal famine of 1943. And per 1,000 deaths, the ratio was 61 lower caste Hindus as opposed to 19 caste Hindus. So there was also a difference in terms of social status. People who belong to a higher status survived more than those who belong to a lower status. The Hindi poet Suryakant Tripathi Nirala lost almost his entire family during the 1918 epidemic. Such was the scale of the illness. He spoke of the river Ganga being swollen with bodies that were floated down because there was no means of burying them, cremating them. The entire infrastructure of care that is associated with death had broken down. In New York right now, the story is breaking of corpses that are being mass buried, right? Because there's no way of coping with the number of deaths that are happening in that city. And we shall discover mass graves further down the line in the US, and that will probably become the subject of another history. An interesting interesting fact that I could mention here is that some of you may have heard, or all of you may have heard of James Corbett, after whom one of the national parks in India is named. He was somebody who was a hunter turned conservationist. He wrote The Man-Eaters of Kumaon. And one of the speculations in the book is that it may have been because of the number of corpses that were thrown into the jungles in the sub-Himalayan region that tigers developed a taste for human flesh. So there are a whole set of things that one could begin to think about with epidemics, social issues of social and cultural history, and indeed probably beginning to think about images of illness within literature. So when you think about Nirala writing about illness, Gandhi in his diaries and in his letters speaking about how unwell he was feeling, he attributed it to dysentery at that time in 1918, but probably he was one other person afflicted by the influenza that was doing the rounds. So we still need a richer literature on some of this in our historical work. And all of this may have started with a ship carrying troops that reached Bombay on 29th May 1918 and docked there for 48 hours. That's 2 days. The ship carried to India the H1N1 influenza virus from the trenches of World War I. So suddenly the world became a smaller place. The World War was not a world war only because the entire globe was involved in either as colonies or as independent nations fighting each other. But then when you think about the major battlefields of the First World War, they were Africans, Asians, Europeans, Americans. And one of the significant features of the First World War was trench warfare. And if you can imagine people trapped in trenches, a greater breeding ground for disease cannot be conceived of. So in that sense, the ship that carried the troops to Bombay, returning from the war, also these bodies brought back an illness with them. And if you think about it, the world is a small place for a virus that depends on hitchhiking on host bodies to get around. Interestingly, while we have archival, visual, administrative evidence for famine, plagues, and so on in colonial India, the historian David Arnold has pointed out that there is very little historiographical evidence for Asian societies in general of the 1918 pandemic. So it's not only India, we're thinking about Southeast Asia as well. And this may be due to the fact that in colonial times, the fact that places like Asia were seen as sites of disease, that disease was common, illness was common. So the authorities didn't pay much attention unless deaths happened on a really major scale. So 1896 had seen the Bubonic Plague. And this is important to know because this was probably the greatest crisis of British rule since 1857, resulting in, again, 10 million deaths. There had been colonial intervention on a very large scale. The government had sanctioned the entering of homes, body searches, forced quarantine, and all of this had created a whole set of disturbances within a very, very conservative caste society where the touching of bodies, there are large numbers of prohibitions. The home was seen as a space into which a stranger, particularly a mlecha, foreigner, could not enter. So the 1896 bubonic plague leads to the first political assassination in India of W.G. Rand, the plague commissioner by the Chapekar brothers, who were both Brahmins. Arguably, the colonial government was chastened by this and therefore was less proactive during the flu. Now, this is something that we can only speculate about. Interestingly, here, another point that we need to note is that colonial medicine's expertise was in parasitology and bacteriology, not virology. Right? And even now, when we think about the medical establishment and the search for a vaccine for COVID-19, viruses have a way of getting around our medical systems. And those of you who were on YouTube and watched Donald Trump pronounce on this about how the virus is extremely brilliant and makes it very. So there's some a grain of truth in what he was saying at that point. So that if you survive one viral episode, it does not mean that you will survive another, right? I mean, if the viruses keep mutating and so on. So the colonial medicine's expertise was in parasitology and bacteriology. So if you think about Robert Koch, who discovered the plague bacillus, and Ronald Ross, who discovered that the Anopheles mosquito causes malaria, two Nobel Prizes, which came from the colony and from colonial medicine, virology was still not there. Interestingly, what survives for us from the 1896 plague in India is the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. A lot of colonial legislation governs Indian life even right now in independent India. So the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 was invoked on March 12, 2020, if you remember, allowing for inspection, segregation, all the strategies that had been evolved under colonial rule. It had been used earlier, in earlier instances as well, in case of swine flu, dengue, cholera in Vadodara in 2018, and so on. So the Spanish flu of 1918 provides us a point of entry into a set of issues that are about public health, that are about governmental control, about social attitudes, which then takes us to the Wuhan COVID-19 and the longer histories. So this section is a relation between economic history and epidemiology. Now, why are these viruses now proliferating? Why do we have these instances happening every year right now? It's not as if this is a episode that takes a decade before something else comes up. Almost every year there's a new virus that's coming up. And we've had avian flu, we've had swine flu, we've had the SARS, we've had the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, and so on and so forth. Now, Wuhan itself is the nucleus for the steel, concrete, and construction industry, sucking up labor from all parts of China. And China is, in contemporary times, the workshop of the world. It's also the home of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is what led to many conspiracy theories about China having manufactured the virus. An article recently in Medicine and Nature pointed to the fact that this virus is not something that can be produced in a lab. It has resulted, it has come about as a result of natural mutations. And the third thing that most people have now got to know is the prevalence of what are called wet markets, selling meat, vegetables, and perishable goods in Wuhan. So in that sense, what we have here is a combination of large numbers of people massing in a city, the city itself expanding beyond its earlier frontiers, encroaching on other ecosystems, and the prevalence of wet markets which are selling meat of not only of sheep, pigs, hens, and so on in insanitary conditions very often, but also of other animals. So while we've had earlier epidemics like SARS and MERS, some of them have, as you remember, have had names like avian and swine flu. The relation between viruses and the names of animals, and this is important because it reminds us that what we're looking at here is the phenomenon of what is called zoonotic transfer of viruses from animals to humans. Viruses need hosts in order to survive. Right? It's unlike bacteria, which can reproduce themselves. The viruses need hosts. And as you know, in the Spanish flu, as I mentioned earlier, large numbers of the troops returning carried the viruses within them. So if we begin to think with the situation of what is happening in Wuhan, and probably think slightly further back to another period in history as well, there is a connection between capitalist agriculture, urbanization, an incursion into other ecosystems. What we're seeing is the encounter with what may be called wild strains, leading to what are zoonotic leaps from animals to humans. Those of you in Kerala, those of you who are now, will remember the film Virus, right? And the way the story begins at the end, as it were, of the film, where there is this young man who is a victim who handles a bat, right? A fruit bat, and an act of compassion where he picks up a fruit bat from the road, puts it in beside the road into a tree branch, but that causes that zoonotic transfer from the bat to the human being. We're also thinking about conditions of meat production, for example, where the packing of animals together on industrial farms, the cultivation of genetic monocultures of domestic animals, which removes immune firewalls that actually slow down transmission. We're talking about crowded conditions. Right? So this mass industrial production of animals, which depress the immune response. So you find a few thousand animals within a very small space. The idea is to produce more and more meat for world consumption. The avian flu and the earlier mad cow disease of the 1980s, 90s was caused by viruses. Now, one of the ways in which there has been a response to this, the virus in livestock, has been the attempt to suppress outbreaks by mass culling, as in the African swine fever, which incidentally led to the loss of around 25% of the world's supply. But culling only creates hypervirulent strains. The strain of the virus is interested in its own survival, as we know, just as much as we are. So hypervirulent strains emerge out of this. So when we think about these viral epidemics, we are in a process of learning, and the learning curve is very steep because the viruses are mutating, newer forms of virus are emerging, even as our ecosystems are expanding into other zones. So what is interesting here is that what is happening in China now, or what happened in China late last year in November and December, is what was happening at an earlier time in the US and Europe, when they were becoming hubs of global production and mass industrial employment. So in that sense, there's a sense of deja vu. We have been there before. So for example, in England, the mass clearing of peasants and the cultivation of monocultures of livestock in the 18th century, just prior to the onset of the Industrial Revolution, had led to pandemics between 1709 to 1786 through the course of the 18th century. And each of these pandemics had spanned between 1 to 2 decades in length. Most of the origins were in imported cattle, which were coming in from Europe and centered on large London dairies. So in that sense, it's a situation similar to that what we are seeing in China right now, as England was emerging as the hub of production. There's a leap in economic production that's happening and so on. In the late 19th century, you have the Rinderpest outbreak in Africa in 1890s among cattle and wild animals. It's interesting here again that we must think here again about the context of colonization and the opening up of Africa after the Berlin Conference of 1885. So Africa is opened up to a larger global space that is created by colonialism and empire. And it is then that you have the viruses finding newer landscapes to control and travel in. So 80 to 90% of all cattle were killed in the Rinderpest outbreak in Africa. And that was, again, something that was obviously on a very significant scale for a largely agricultural economy. Now, if you think about the origins of COVID-19, which, if you've looked at pages, is rather beautiful to look at, right? Those of you who've seen pictures of the virus. And in fact, in Bengal, they've been making sweets for people to eat, which look like the coronavirus. So it's left its mark in our histories of consumption. It's about 1,000th the width of an eyelash. And there's some very interesting articles in the science magazines about this. And it's capable of duplicating itself within a cell 10,000 times within hours. If you look at the landscape of infection, the way in which COVID-19 spreads involves pigs, snakes, bats, and wild game meat like the pangolin. And given the pressure of primary industries in China and the disruption of local ecosystems, animals are being pushed into less accessible areas, coming in contact with isolated disease strains. So you can see the kind of domino effect of all of this: industrial production, the expansion of cities, the coming in of workers in large numbers, staying under insanitary and unhygienic conditions, the sheer pressure of population, the pressure that's put on ecosystems that adjoin this landscape, and animals being pushed into less accessible areas, coming in contact with isolated disease strains which are virulent, and animals themselves are becoming the targets for commodified consumption. So there's an increased demand for bodies of wild animals for consumption as much as for medical use. And this, combined with new global commodity chains, disperse the virus. Right? So what we're seeing here is a very complex interaction of forces which are both local, but because we live in a globalized world, the connections spread every small event into larger and larger geographies. And humans are getting closer to animals, which leads to biological spillover very easily. We saw this in the case of the Ebola virus, which is the result of a viral reservoir spilling over into a human population. Here again, bats, which are native to Central and West Africa, were the carriers. The resurfacing of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2018, you saw very similar kinds of things happening. Primary industries displacing forest-dwelling peoples, land was being sold to agribusiness conglomerates, particularly the palm oil industry, and the rural poor began hunting wild game, as in China. So when we ask what role the pangolin plays in China, similarly, that people, as they are pushed to the extremities of subsistence, then begin to hunt in the forests animals that they have not eaten before, and so on and so forth. As in the case of the Spanish flu, the high death rate in the case of Ebola virus was in a situation of malnourishment, urban overcrowding, unsanitary living, accompanied by global trade, of course. But if one looks at all of this, let's get back to the issue of public health that I took up earlier when I spoke about the number of deaths under colonial rule in India, which were largely the result of the non-existence of a public health system, or the fact that public health systems catered to certain groups of people, and this is true even in our times. At present, the coronavirus has also come about in a situation of a degradation of basic health care, whether it's in China or the USA or the United Kingdom. So the national health system in the United Kingdom is in a state of crisis. In the United States, public health is really not accessible. Donald Trump has been working very hard to dismantle what was called Obamacare, the system of medical insurance put into place by President Obama. And within the American medical system, as much as the medical system in the United Kingdom, you have the ratio of deaths of underprivileged minorities being rather high. So, for example, large numbers of African Americans are dying within the medical systems who are carers, not people who are patients, who are carers in the US. And in Britain, you have the large numbers of deaths of what are called Black and minority ethnicity personnel. So around 6 doctors of the BAME category have died, which makes one wonder what exactly is happening under the national health system in England. I mean, are there forms of racism, or why are there no more white doctors who are at the forefront in this war against COVID-19? Within China, too, we have seen an earlier tradition of barefoot doctors in local healthcare, which has been slowly falling apart since the 90s. And over the years, a combination of neglect and privatization. China's public spending on health is only 50% that of Bulgaria or Brazil. Just think about these countries in terms of their population as much as their economies. with the onrush, the coming in of migrant labor into these cities like Wuhan, only 20% of migrant labor had medical insurance or indeed any access to healthcare. A very interesting statistic for China is that the attacks on medical staff are enormously high. In a series of interviews that was done, 85% of medical personnel had experienced violence in the workplace. In India, this is a ticking time bomb combined with social attitudes towards nurses and doctors. If you think about it, nurses are mainly Christian. They come from the south and from the northeast. We've seen a spate of attacks on people who are coming from the northeast in India. So it's not so much only the question of COVID-19 and the virus, it's the attitudes that surface at times of crisis, because all of these epidemics work through the fault lines in society, making them more exaggerated. So if you think about Amartya Sen writing on the famine in Bengal, he said it was less the availability of food and more a problem of distribution that was the problem. And here again, we must think to ourselves that it's not only about the COVID virus, it's about the state of our public health systems and the access that people have to inexpensive public health care. Now, Kerala stands out in this regard. It really is an outlier. So, for example, if one looks at Paul Richards, an anthropologist's book on Ebola, he shows how a people's science, as he calls it, helped end an epidemic. So urban populations were working with epidemiologists and medical responders in the urban slums of Upper West Africa. So when we think about situations like this, we need public healthcare systems. We have to be clear that it's not a top-down approach that's going to help, that epidemiology is a people's science. Everyone has to get involved. So that was a kind of a huge scale of history that I tried to put into place in a very short time. Now I want to think about the last two aspects of the talk, thinking about pan-democracy, to go back to the idea that of democracy under pandemics, and coronopticon, or the idea of state surveillance in the time of the coronavirus. So we're seeing a strengthening of state power, and at the same time, we're also seeing an erosion of democracy in this period. So, for example, in India, what we're seeing right now is a domestic counterinsurgency, as it were. We've seen the arrests of Anand Teltumbre and Gautam Naulakha, as also Safura Sargar, Umar Khalid, Miran Haider, under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 2019. So the COVID-19 period has become an occasion to crack down on dissent when public protest is forbidden. So now you can't have large numbers of people on the streets congregating. Shaheen Bagh is also, as you know, is something that shortly after the COVID-19 epidemic started, it was dismantled. But all over the world, this is happening. China has been tightening control over islands in the South China Sea and arresting Democrats in Hong Kong. As you know, there was a whole series of protests happening in Hong Kong, about which we're hearing less, given the circumstances. On March 30th, Viktor Orban in Hungary passed the coronavirus law, a curious name for a law, because the law had nothing to do with medical care or public health. It gave the prime minister the right to rule by decree and no expiry date. So Viktor Orban's dictatorship will last beyond the end of COVID-19 epidemic. 84 countries all over the world have declared a state of emergency, and not only that, a medical emergency, but the fact that they've appropriated to themselves emergency powers which allow them to control populations, crack down on dissent, and so on. And if you think about the life of a phrase like social distancing, in Serbia, in Togo, in Cambodia, in Azerbaijan, I'm just picking countries at random, there are large numbers of countries we could talk about, social distancing has been used as a phrase by the government in power to suggest that those members of the opposition should be socially distanced, right? So it's a way of keeping dissent out of the center of political discourse. In Uganda, what we've seen are attacks on gay and transgender people under cover of the COVID-19, the argument being that some groups of people are more prone to ill health, the more prone as carriers of the virus. In India, we've seen this happen, unfortunately, following the Tablighi Jamaat meeting. And hashtag Corona Jihad, as it's been called, accusations where a particular religious community is being targeted as a vector of the disease. We've seen the tightening of controls on social media. 38 countries have passed legislation which allows government to monitor any form of social media. There have been calls, as you know, recently to ban Twitter in India and set up its, and that India should set up its own version. The Arogya Setu app has been seen by a large number of social critics as an attempt to track citizens' movements. The government, meanwhile, wants all of us to download the app onto our phones. To take up a side story in all of this, but a crucial story, our societies are characterized by different forms of inequality, but they're also characterized by the people that we put away, the people who are segregated from society. So even before quarantining, we have the very idea of the prison. 125 countries all over the world, right, of the 200 plus countries, hold more prisoners than their systems are capable of handling. And what we're seeing is the interesting phenomenon of the opening up of the prisons, right? And it's happening in curious countries. 90,000 prisoners were released in Turkey because they felt that the prisons would become breeding grounds of disease. So basically, you send the prison population out. The crimes, I don't know whether they've been pardoned, but the prison walls have been opened up. Iran has released around 85,000 prisoners. The United States has released 16,000. In Brazil and Colombia, there have been prison riots, as prisoners have argued that being cooped up in prisons is something that would lead to more deaths. It must be remembered that USA, China, and Brazil, between them, have the world's largest prison populations. So here again, a set of issues which extend into the domain of the political and the social. So we're thinking about the virus in terms of its effects on political processes and on social norms as much as its effects on a human body. Right? So finally, I'll stop here because I think I may have spoken for around 40, 45 minutes. I'm not sure how long I've spoken because we got interrupted in between. So what happens next? So if you think about the idea of social distancing, which has become quite crucial in keeping ourselves apart from other people, and this is not just a neutral act. There are some people we are more apart from than others. And in an unequal and hierarchical society of ours, such as ours, how do we recover now a sense of community? How do we recover a larger social empathy? How do we begin to see the faces in the crowd around us and see those faces equally? So the philosopher Levinas spoke about the face of the other, that compassion and humanity lies in recognizing the face of the other. But what happens when that face has a face mask on, for example? So where does empathy go? How do we think about forms of empathy or of affinity or of compassion when we are thinking about a society that is separating people from each other? We had stopped hearing each other after the earphones, right? Now we will stop seeing each other with our face masks on. So there are multiple implications of COVID-19 in terms of how the connectedness between us as human beings will continue to survive. Will we move towards a kind of faceless, masked society, as it were? That's something to think about. But on the other hand, we could also ask, will new social solidarities emerge? Because what is interesting is that in this time, we've also seen a reaching out, right? Pro-social behavior, as it's been called. The organizations of the neighborhood, checking up on neighbors, where people have tried to explore other forms of sociability just as much as we are talking to each other now. Over WebEx, for example, we've discovered other forms of connecting with people, teaching, and so on and so forth. So we are thinking about other forms of mediations that may emerge, both socially and technologically, which will allow us to reconnect with each other, not only with our neighbors, but also the stranger in our midst. when I say the stranger in our midst, I don't mean somebody who's completely unknown, but also thinking to people who are invisible to us, the forms of labor that exist. When I talked about that huge abandonment of labor, abandonment to the poor that we have seen in India, where migrant laborers are traveling huge distances to get back home. They're attacked on the way by the police. Their punitive measures are taken against them. So how do we move to a situation where we are able to react with compassion to the stranger in our midst, right? Somebody who is invisible to us so far. Finally, our job as, since I don't know the audience that I'm talking to, I'm assuming a lot of your students, a lot of your academics, how do we think a new world, given the constraints that I've been talking about, given the kind of aberrations that have emerged? How can we think a new world? Can a virus prompt good philosophy? Right? This is an occasion for us to think about new forms of sociability, new forms of relating to each other. And history allows us to think back and learn. Right? So what we can do, I'm a historian by profession, it allows me to think back to previous periods, think about what went wrong, and it allows me to learn. But we also have to think ahead to forms of living together again. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you very
much. Sir, we have a few questions here.
Yes.
I'll just read it out for you. The first question is...
Yeah.
You can hear me, right?
I can hear you. I'm taking notes as you speak.
Okay. The first question is, we have seen that huge amount of money was spent for controlling pollution, but nothing worked out. But now after the lockdown, everything is back to normal, including the ozone layer. Do you feel this technique can be adopted once in a year worldwide to protect the nature?
Okay.
That's the first question. Should I read out all the questions?
Yeah, I can take three at a time.
Okay, fine. The second one is, what will be the future of UNO, WHO, etc.?
Okay.
And the next question is, human race has grown over the carrying capacity of Earth. And it's been said that if we grow like this, we need 3 Earths to sustain population. Is nature trying to restrict the population through these recurring novel virus attacks?
Okay. Right. So I'll just take those 3 questions. Actually, what's interesting is that we've seen the large numbers of images of nature coming back, as it were, nature returning. So, for example, the famous photograph that was doing the rounds in the social media of the civet cat, Marapati, which was wandering around the streets of Calicut, photographs of leopards wandering around streets in Chandigarh, for example. And in some sense, the kind of absenting of humans from a landscape, right? And we've talked about encroachment on ecosystems in the course of the lecture. It's interesting to think about this and also to wonder by the limits of this, as an example. So David Attenborough, in one of his series on nature, he has an episode on Chernobyl. Right? As you know, in 1986, there was that massive nuclear reactor explosion, and the whole area of Chernobyl was irradiated, and it's now a depopulated zone. There are no people living there. Interestingly enough, what you have is a return of life, meaning that large numbers of animals, animals like wolves, as he points out, a wolf doesn't come unless there are animals to hunt. So wolves, deers are coming back and occupying that landscape. The large numbers of mutant insects and plants which have grown. The extinct species, right? A species which was once considered extinct. Przewalski's horses, now you have the horses galloping across the Chernobyl landscape. If you think about pollution, people are seeing the Himalayas from Delhi, right? Now, when one thinks about all of this, the question is this a sustainable model? So every year, how long do we set aside every year for everything to go back to normal? Right? Do we take a day off? Do we take a week off? Do we take a month off? Is this economically sustainable? What about those who are day laborers and wage laborers? What does it mean to be deprived of an income for a week, a day, a month? So I think what we need to do is to use this occasion to think very seriously about the ways in which our economies are organized, where the production itself is unsustainable in terms of its relation to nature. We've had all these debates about global warming, melting of the ice caps. In some sense, the COVID-19 needs to be added to the mix. Because you've seen for a brief moment what will happen, what could happen if human beings stop their relentless attacks on nature. Right? And that's something to think about. About the United Nations and the World Health Organization, these have always been institutions based on idealism and on goodwill, but also working along the fault lines of power in the world. So, for example, when Donald Trump says that he will no longer fund the World Health Organization, we have to ask, how are these international organizations going to be sustained, particularly when you're dealing with problems on a global scale like this? COVID-19 is not an issue for Kerala or India or Asia alone. It's a global problem. What are the new forms of global connections, global systems of care and sustenance that can come up? Are the UN and the World Health Organization relics of another time, where a new world was imagined after the Second World War? Have they outlived their purpose, given a unipolar world in which the United States basically can withdraw funds from the UNESCO, it can withdraw funds from World Health Organizations, that these are not united organizations. They work along the issues of power in the world. So how do we reconceptualize? The third question was really, is nature working to set things to right? I mean, I'm not sure how we should conceive of nature. Right? I mean, this is rather like when the Bihar earthquake happened in the 30s, and Gandhi said, well, this is nature's punishment to India for having the caste system. Rabindranath Tagore said this is the most unscientific view. Right? So nature doesn't work in these ways of balancing, and this goes back to Malthus's argument that war, famines, disease are the ways in which checks have happened, right? Keeping world populations down. But I think we can't leave it all to nature. Right? I mean, there are ways in which you have to curb our greed, you have to curb our desire for power. You also have to think about the fact that when we think about lives being lost in our mind, and at the back of our mind is a thought that is rather disturbing, that we think about dispensable population, that it doesn't matter when certain groups of people die, right? Their deaths are merely a statistic. So in that sense, every life is valuable. So when you think about people dying, it's not enough for us to say, nature offers us a corrective because we are alive. Important people are alive, politicians are alive, and we have this idea of an invisible mass dying out there. But we have to remember that we have to think with humanity as a whole. Yeah. So that's my answer.
Okay, sir. I'll ask you 3 more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Next is, Kerala's health service sector is now being lauded worldwide, and the healthcare professionals especially. Nurses from Kerala are often compared with the best in the world. Do you think Kerala can make the opportunities that is going to arise in health service sector post-pandemic worldwide count? Is this a blessing in disguise? That's our first question.
Okay.
Second one, why are we not learning from history after facing many pandemic situations? Why are we not becoming proactive in matters of health and environment?
Okay.
And the third one, sir, there are rumors about the origin of coronavirus. Some say it's man-made and others say it is originated in animals and spread to human. And countries are blaming each other. Do we have any confirmed source of origin?
Okay.
So we have a few more questions. I'll give it to you in the next. 3 more, can you take it?
Yeah, I can take, yes.
Okay. So the next question is, what will be the condition of the next generation if these epidemics come annually?
Okay.
And one more, concerning your last remark about normalization of face masks, until recently there has been opposition to wearing a veil, niqab in France, and the logic was that it is against sociality. So what happens to this argument now?
Excellent. Thank you. So with regard to, I'll take these questions in random order. With regard to the face mask and the veil, this is a very, very interesting question because in Europe, the question has been that of displaying your individuality in your face, right? And the fear of becoming a faceless society. And the coming in of Islam or Muslims into Europe following, I mean, for obvious reasons. I mean, after European colonial wars of devastation, it's now the empire coming back to roosts, as it were. So this question of the veil was a way of saying, well, we have people in our midst who are, in some sense, pre-modern, far too religious, superstitious, and this was allied with security concerns, and that was a pragmatic presentation of the problem, that if you can't see people, if you can't see people's faces, then you don't know whether they pose a security threat, all of those kinds of things. Now, interestingly enough, you think about a phrase like to lose face. After this kind of idea, right? We are seen as societies in Asia where losing face is important, but you look at Japan and Southeast Asia, people are wearing face masks with no problem. This was a wonderful article by the anthropologist Peter van der Veer on this, pointing to the paradox of European societies allowing face masks, but not being able to countenance veils, or the argument being made by others that everybody is now catching up with Islam, right? So the veil was always a good, healthy thing to have, and so on and so forth. So this is not an answer to the question, but I think there's a whole set of debates that are in. With regard to the controversies regarding origin, I mean, in the case of the United States, Trump is planning to sue China. I don't see how one sovereign power can sue another. The state of Missouri has gone to court to say that China should pay for the origins of the virus. There have been questions about whether this was some kind of biological warfare. People have been looking at science fiction novels like that of Michael Crichton of around 30 years ago, which mentioned Wuhan. But what is very clear in the scientific evidence and in the articles that have been published is that this is not a virus manufactured in a laboratory, right? And this sets controversies to rest. Right? Viruses have mutated and a new virus has come into origin. Well, the reasons that I've been spelling out in terms of the spillover into new ecosystems and so on and so forth. Now, with regard to Kerala's health service sector, I mean, a lot of people are looking to Kerala as a model. Now, what is important to remember is that one can't just replicate model. Now, you can't say, well, Kerala has done this successfully. Now, let's transplant the model to Uttar Pradesh, for example. What we see in Kerala is a result of around 70, 80 years of political mobilization, social mobilization, education, the fact that in Tirudangur and Kochi, we had progressive monarchies which set up hospitals. We had the influence of missionaries. We are talking about a really complex mix in which religious communities live in peace. There are high levels of literacy. There are high levels of political and social literacy, which means that people have a sense of their own dignity as well as a sense of what they can expect from government. We've seen in the 90s a devolution of power through to local self-government. So what we have is a set of mentalities and political and social processes into which we must put in this idea of public health. So even something like the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad's activities of an earlier period, which alerted people to having more scientific attitudes to health and disease and so on. So I think Kerala's health service sector demands study. Right? It demands study in order to show you what goes into creating a medically, politically, and socially literate population. But I don't think that you can just recreate this model elsewhere, transplant it in Bogota or Uttar Pradesh or elsewhere. The interesting thing, again, is that if you think about the fact that most of the nurses in India are Christian, a lot of them in the initial stages came from Kerala. It also reflects something of our caste society, where Hindus are not, prone to touch other bodies. Untouchability is one of the premises of Hinduism and of being a Hindu. So it had to be from the Christian community that you had these notions of compassion and service emerging. So that's again something to think about, but that's also connected with Kerala's social history. About learning from history, and the next generation. I mean, this is something that human beings, when we say human beings should learn from history, I think every generation repeats the mistakes of the previous one. If we are not like an organism that stores the genetic memory of previous failure and previous success, and then we move towards and we move towards actually nurturing what is actually more compassionate or a better way of relating to each other and to the world. What happens is that each generation reproduces the mistakes of the past. And I don't know whether learning from history can be done in other than an abstract sense. Right? So the next generation, how will they be affected by this? I think what is happening increasingly is that we are beginning to understand that we live in times where the world has become a much more fragile place. Right? If you think about the fact that in my generation, in the 1980s, when I went to university, I was seriously convinced that the world would end as a result of a nuclear holocaust. That was the major thing that loomed on the horizon. Hiroshima was far away, but not that far away. I was studying in England at that point. We went on marches protesting against nuclear armament. There was a campaign for nuclear disarmament. This generation sees global warming as the threat. And every generation grows up with a sense of the end of the world. And I think that is good, because it is that allows us to put on the brakes as we reach the edge of the precipice. And I think the next generation will survive, and it is from the next generation that the answers will come. As you've seen in the case of Malala Yousafzai or Greta Thunberg, these are, in some sense, as they're called, children, but they're also alerting us to the fundamental problems that exist in the world of gender inequality, of the fact of an indiscriminate growth of capitalism and industry, the fact of human impact on the environment, which is devastating. So the next generation will create the space for another generation to emerge.
So we have one more last interesting question, just one more. I'll read it out for you. Mentioning about the river Ganga being filled with the dead bodies in 1918 Spanish flu, and a century later, a mother drowning her 5 kids in Ganga in Uttar Pradesh in the lockdown period of hunger. How will a country of ours bracing to defend this virus, and a state with more than 20 million population clamping only the political propaganda matters rather than the common sense to overcome this menace? Is India being awed out in this pandemic?
Actually, this is a very, very important and very sharp and very acute political question. To go back to what I stated sometime in the lecture about Amartya Sen, that when we talk about phenomena like famines, that this is not, famines don't arise because there's a shortage of food. It's about redistribution. How do you redistribute and provide food for the existing food for people around you? And very often it's a crisis in information, not knowing, there not being a free press. So great famines happened in China. The government is interested in suppressing the information about that. The world gets to know about it much later, and the massive scale of deaths. So here too, when we think about our country, and particularly if you think about the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the state with the largest population, it's being governed in a way that all political dissent is forbidden. There are ways in which the government is not working, like in Kerala, to set up structures of proper governance, of public health, of education. So what we are seeing in large parts of northern India, and particularly under the Hindu Nationalist Party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is that there isn't enough investment being put in the building up of social capital. Right? Creating higher levels of education, allowing for a free press, allowing for dissent, political dissent, because all of these are the ways in which one gains knowledge about crises that are happening. If you shut down information, you're going to have more deaths. Right? So in that sense, I think the reaction in India, luckily we are a federal structure. So in UP, it's interesting, if you look at the statistics from the Uttar Pradesh, it's a state with the lowest number of people affected by coronavirus. Right? Now, is this the result of being a healthy state, or is it the result of it being a repressive state where, one, the medical systems don't exist to test? Two, if figures are known, these figures are not available to the rest of India because there is no free press. Three, if somebody raises the issue, they're arrested and or detained and so on and so forth. So here what we need to understand is that the virus enters a situation where a social and political situation where it can actually wreak havoc and destruction. In Kerala, it enters a space which is politically literate, has systems in place which have been thought out over several decades. So the virus is contained. So Kerala was pretty high up, right? If you all of you remember, it was fairly high up in terms of cases, and now it's dipped. And our curve is beginning to flatten. I worry about places like Uttar Pradesh where we don't know. Right? So we don't even know what's happening before we can think about a solution. Thank you.
Okay, sir. So we'll be winding up the session, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've enjoyed speaking to people, though I wish we had had more human interaction. But thank you all for all the 157 people who logged in at various points. It was at 200 at some point. Thank you for joining me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
Hello, sir. Must be here. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation and being here with us.